Welcome back, everyone. Grimm and I have a doozy of a topic in store this time as we continue our investigation of Sekiro. We'll be taking a look at the Fountainhead Nobles, and in the process we'll be explaining a lot of the history behind the world of Sekiro. So grab your eel livers and don't drink the water as we begin our first multiple episode investigation into the digital folklore of Sekiro. So by now I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Fountainhead Nobles, the strange group of flute-playing, otherworldly creatures that seem to populate the Fountainhead Palace. If you haven't seen them yet, then you all need to stop listening to Al. Seriously, I know he's supposed to be your dad and all, but Sekiro's allowed to have a rebellious phase by now. Anyway, the Fountainhead Nobles themselves are a pretty strange bunch altogether. I mean, just look at them. Are they a fish? Some kind of proto-dragon? Or maybe some weird kind of plant? Surprisingly, the answer is yes. To all of them. But before we get into what the Fountainhead Nobles are, it's better for us to take a look at what the Fountainhead Nobles were. Now let me clarify for a moment here. When I say we need to look at what the Fountainhead Nobles were, I mean specifically let's look at who they were when they were still human. And we know the nobles were once human since we have the opportunity to see the transformation firsthand when the head priest of Mibu Village transforms after being given the water of the palace. So who were the Fountainhead Nobles originally? Well, it seems that answer comes in two parts. The original nobles and the Okami warriors. So let's start with the original nobles first. Specifically, I'm referring to the male nobles who we usually see playing flutes. These nobles are most likely the original inhabitants of the Fountainhead Palace, as in they were regular nobility before the arrival of the Divine Dragon. We know from the description of the Divine Grass, as well as the Divine Dragon Remnant, that there was a part of Ashina that was exceedingly old and drew the attentions of the gods of the land. This land is where the Fountainhead Palace was established. At the time, it was most likely just considered a sacred part of Ashina and did not grant any special powers to those who lived there. Instead, it was most likely just a place where the nobles had their palace constructed given its sacred status and, judging from the wreckage at the front of the palace, was probably connected to a village that served the palace originally. However, this changed with the arrival of the Divine Dragon. Drawn by the ancient soil and water that attracted the gods to the Fountainhead, the Divine Dragon made its way to the Fountainhead Palace as well and took root there. Around this time, whether through the intent of the nobles or as a result of the dragon taking root, the palace itself became separated from the village that was attached to it. The remnants of the village would most likely go on to become Mibu Village, given the shared name as indicated by Mibu Manor. Now separated from the rest of Ashina, the nobles, exposed to the full rejuvenative powers of the water, began to transform. Or rather, some of them did at least. We'll come back to that. We don't know exactly when this occurred, but judging by the details we find in the Fountainhead Palace, we can most likely place this as occurring sometime during the Heian period, a period of Japanese history which lasted from 794 to 1185. Now what makes me so sure that this occurred during the Heian period? Well, since the nobles became literally isolated from the rest of the world during this separation, and were now living much longer due to the transformation brought on by drinking the water of the palace, their culture wouldn't change. As a result, the bits of their culture we can see indicate just when the isolation occurred. So what signs do we see that indicate that these nobles are from the Heian period? Well, one of the first is the clothing which the Fountainhead nobles are wearing. The appearance is quite similar to the kind of formal clothing that nobility would wear during the Heian period. In fact, their robes can actually tell us even more about them. You see, their outfit is known as a sokutai, and the color of these robes were indicative of a noble's rank. Dark blue is indicative of one of the lower ranks, which is what most of the Fountainhead nobles we see are wearing. Meanwhile, red robes were indicative of a higher rank, which we only see a few nobles wearing. The last color robe we see any of the nobles wearing is the great Carp Attendant, who is wearing purple robes. Now traditionally, purple was reserved for the highest ranks, but in the Heian period, the color of the highest ranks was changed to black and purple was removed. In this case then, his purple robes may be used to indicate his special role as attendant for the great Carp. We'll discuss exactly why those different robe colors are important later though. But the clothing is not all that hints towards the time period, since as we progress through the palace, we find even more similarities connecting the palace to the Heian period. For example, we also find some of the guards playing some type of sport and even attacking us using the ball as a weapon. The ball itself is known as a mari, and the game they are playing is known as kamari and is a popular ball game from the Heian period. The game itself might best be described as something akin to hacky sack, where the goal is to keep the mari in the air without using your hands. Though games aren't the only pastime from the Heian period which we see the Fountainhead nobles taking part in. As we approach the platform in the middle, we see one of the nobles performing a kind of dance in front of an audience of other nobles. This dance is known as bugaku, and was a type of dance that was popular amongst the Japanese nobility of the time. In fact, another element of bugaku that is seen in the game comes in the form of the dancer's mask item, which itself is based off of a bugaku mask. Bugaku itself was usually performed to the accompaniment of court music known as gagaku, which made use of the large taiko or drums that we see next to the platform. These taiko themselves also provide evidence that suggests they are from the Heian period, as they are marked with the tomoe emblem, or in this case the Mitsudo moe, which became a popular emblem during the end of the Heian period. Also, I know what you're thinking, but this is another time where the name is probably coincidental, but that's a discussion for another time. Finally, the Heian period itself would be a likely time period for the Divine Dragon to come to Ashina, as it was the time period in Japan when Chinese and Korean influence was near its peak. As I discussed in a previous video, this was the most likely origin for the Divine Dragon, so it would make sense that it might arrive in Japan during a period when this influence was at its height. Now, this connection to the Heian period is important for more than just cosmetic reasons. It also goes a long way in explaining the attitude and nature of the court nobles as well. You see, during the Heian period, the life of the court nobility was detached from the day-to-day life of an average villager. In fact, it was far detached. So far detached that it isn't an exaggeration to say that they lived in two entirely different worlds. The life of the common villager was one of struggle and hardship, but the life of the court nobility was beyond luxurious. Some of the literature from the Heian period depicts some of the nobles' hardships, such as becoming bored with their usual pastimes or the difficulties that came with their multiple love affairs. Not exactly the kind of complaint that's likely to resonate with someone who's working hard just to avoid starvation, is it? You see, the Heian court tried very hard to mimic the court life of the Chinese or Koreans, but unlike the other two systems, the Heian system didn't allow upward mobility based on merit, but rather on heredity. This meant that the court life of the nobles was surprisingly stagnant, as their positions were usually guaranteed. So instead, they became isolated and secular, focusing more of their attention towards the arts than to statecraft or other more worldly matters. And this is definitely reflected in the state we find the nobles when we arrive at the palace. They are seemingly unconcerned with the potential war or strife that is brewing in the land below, and are instead focused on games, music, or dance, even as the palace around them crumbles into disrepair. This representation of the nobles lends further credence to the idea that the dragon came to the Fountainhead Palace sometime during the Heian period. So now that we established what happened to the nobles of the palace during this time period, what became of the villagers who once served the palace? Well, either as a result of this separation or through their own choice, they established themselves near the base of the Fountainhead waters in Mibu village. This location serves to further represent the isolation of the Fountainhead nobles, as they are now literally worlds apart, as the villagers dwell in the depths of Ashina while the nobles live high among the clouds. The villagers must have had some knowledge of what happened at the Fountainhead Palace though, as the founder of the village developed the Mibu breathing technique knowing that it was necessary as a means to reach the Divine Dragon. It's likely that during this time period that Mibu village and the Fountainhead Palace had established some way to communicate and remain in touch with one another. As further proof of this, Mibu village had established the wedding cave as a way of sending brides to join the Fountainhead nobles, or so they thought anyway. Unfortunately though, as we discover upon our arrival to the Fountainhead Palace, the nobles in their new form have developed a craving for the vitality of youth. Given that there are no female nobles, as female nobles in the Heian period remained secluded and were very unlikely to become warriors such as the Okami women, it seems that many of them turned to their own wives and daughters before convincing the Mibu villagers to send them more women as brides to feed their craving for youth. It's possible that the two elderly women we see are the last of the brides who were sent to feed their hunger, and that their father, the great Carp Attendant, was coerced into agreeing by being tempted with the thought of becoming a noble himself. This too can be seen as representative of Heian court culture though, as marriage was one of the few means of upward social mobility in the court given the focus on blood ties over anything else. So by offering his daughters, he was then welcomed into the nobility. This kind of exchange with Mibu village must have continued for quite some time, with the villagers offering brides in exchange for the rare chance to join the nobility themselves. However, this relationship with Mibu village most likely changed with the arrival of a new group of warriors to the Fountainhead Palace, the Okami. But Grimm's batteries can only handle so much, and we have a lot more to discuss about the nobles, so we'll have to continue this in our next video. Until then, everyone.